the Virgin Mary, virgin goddesses like Athena, Artemis, and Hestia. They have been portrayed as pure, idolized for their innocence, and coded in eternal youth. Meanwhile, figures like Saint Mary Magdalene, the Whore of Babylon, Gorgon priestess Medusa, and Lilith, and so colorful and different portrayals and origin tellings have been demonized for centuries, smeared in shame, portrayed as the fall of humanity, especially ones that come from the oh-so-dangerous womanhood. Womanhood that is wild, womanhood that is unapologetic, independent, and shameless. Womanhood with no king to bow to. Surely, it's not dangerous, is it? Well, for them, the colonial patriarchal rulers who built their temples from the blood and bones of persecuted women for just having a backbone, a voice to speak and a courage to say her truth, it is oh so dangerous. It is dangerous since their throne is built on lies, coercion, and dominion. Once you open your eyes, you'll notice how fragile it is and how much they don't want you to realize it. And today we'll break these chains, or at least try to. We'll talk about the lies they have built on the coercion they've led to and how they've even carved history out like this. I am Elias of Venus, a musician, writer, political activist, and occultist, and this is Virginity and Myth, and how mistranslations became centuries of dominion.
They thought it was over, they sealed it in stone, but you can't kill what was there.
Before we get into the actual video, I would like to kindly mention that I do all this for free. And yet, if you want to help my bankrupt ass in the journey to also be able to provide content more frequently, more qualitatively, and more joyously, I would ask you to check out my esoteric goods shop, Venusian Gnosis. I recently launched it, and currently there's 2 types of products available. Venusian candles and 3 variations and 5 different Venusian oils. The candles are based on 3 currents of the Venusian goddesses frequently embodied, those being the earthly / Gaian archetype with the candle guardian of life, solar with the candle of heart of the sun, and also lunar / celestial goddess archetypes with the candle starry night of the pearl. The oils which came out more recently, they are in 5 variations. There's the pure Venusian oil for Venusian workings of any kind, a come to me attraction oil, a glamour oil that titled irresistible yet unreachable, all named after biblical figure Jezebel for reclaiming power and grounding yourself and on your own divine path, and the rain on me oil meant for prosperity workings. I also provide tarot services, ritual workings, and so on, so just contact me and we can get it done most likely. If you don't want anything in return, though, I do want to mention that I do accept tips, and so the info on that is underneath in the description. Alas, we'll stop begging, but I can also show how the Venusian oils are. Jezebel, come to me. And these are the candles. They're kind of getting out of stock because I sell them in markets outside of the esoteric sphere on the internet. But yeah, that was the Garden of Life. This is the Heart of the Sun. And this is the Starry Night of the Pearl. So, patriarchy didn't just appear out of the blue when one man decided to conquer and control all womanhood. No, it took over 2,500 years till it was solidified, and in its earliest forms, which didn't seem so dangerous yet, it appeared as the patriarchal family, which came to consolidate new gender rules and values expressed as values, customs, laws, and social rules. But it wasn't the only law that constructed the system to stay. It was the metaphors, myths, the folklore, which came part to explain why women shall submit, what's her duty, and why independence became a spiritual pollution. But as it didn't appear out of the blue, there had to be a predecessor, and it was the cult of the goddess, the matriarchal religion, the worship of the mother goddess, and the veneration of the earth mother. In human history, when women played a lesser role in the hunting-gathering stage than the Neolithic age, their involvement in agriculture and in the domestication of animals greatly boosted their social status. In response to this new social environment and increased increased dependence on the fertility of a fixed location, the cults sprang up, dedicated the veneration of the Earth Mother and the goddess of fertility and the creator of life, and that is the Mother. So yes, in prehistoric times, women were often seen as the bearers of life, and many early societies worship female deities that embody fertility, the cycles of nature, and nurturing power of the earth. These goddesses were seen as the creators and protectors, closely tied to the rhythms of the natural world. Ancient civilizations such as those in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and the Mediterranean were heavily influenced by the goddess worship. Goddesses like Inanna, Sumeria, Ishtar, Babylonia, and Cybele from Anatolia were seen as the embodiment of life-giving power. In these societies, women often held high-ranking religious roles as priestesses, and some historians argue that many of these cultures were more egalitarian, if not matriarchal. Across various ancient cultures, the great goddess was seen as the source of all life. In Egypt, Isis was one of the most powerful deities, worshipped as the mother of creation and a healer. In Crete, the Minoan civilization revered a powerful goddess associated with fertility, nature, and the cycles of life and death. The earth itself was often personified as a nurturing mother. Mother Earth, or Gaia as we know her, in Greek tradition was seen as the origin of life, with the power to create and sustain the world. The sacred feminine energy was central to the spiritual and cultural life of many early civilizations. As society advanced, particularly with the development of agriculture, the dynamics of power began to shift. Patriarchal systems began to emerge, particularly with the rise of Indo-European nomadic tribes and Semitic cultures in the Near East. With this shift came the elevation of male deities, and a gradual decline or even demonization of the female goddesses. And as they couldn't grasp enough to control the woman, they started attacking what's one of the most sacred parts of her, the sexuality. 10 or 12,000 years ago, some humans first realized sexual activity actually had something to do with production of a new life, formerly considered an enviable magic embodied only in females. Once fatherhood began to be recognized, man could assert that sexual activity was something more than a mere pleasure, an essential part of the mythical, mysterious miracle of life-giving. It could be revered as sacred. When varying sects of early Christianity were on the rise, there were some Gnostic groups that defined the bliss of heaven as sexual in nature and practiced sacred sex in their shrines like the pagans before them. Figures like Saint Valentine, adopted by the Church as a patron of lovers, was a semi-mythical Valentinas whose festival took place in the Ides of February, the month sacred to the goddess Juno Februata, when she was held in her febris, fever of love. The Gnostics performed what was called a rite of spiritual marriage with angels in the nuptial chamber. Saint Valentine was sketchily Christianized version of the love god, otherwise known as Eros, Cupid, Priapus, or Kama. All names associated with the goddess, I guess, in a sexual ritual aimed at promoting fertility. However, when the official church began to take shape in the early 4th century, the sects that firmly allowed some form of sexual license were condemned. The church was influenced by the trend towards asceticism that began in India, with yogis who claimed that self-denial of all earthly pleasures would enable the performance of miracles like healing the sick, walking on water, and achieving nirvana when still alive. The earliest Christian saints were then declared extreme ascetics who starved, whipped, and deprived and generally abused themselves in order to atone for every sin and become particularly blessed. Sex became the instrument of the devil and a tool whereby women, those daughters of Eve, enticed men into evil behavior. According to St. Augustine, sex was the root of original sin and the means of transmitting it onto all generations. Tertullian said, sex renders marriage obscene. Numenius of Apamea claimed that only total cessation of sexual activity could unite the soul with God. Early fathers of the church became intensely committed to denial and condemnation of sexuality. St. Jerome ordered, regard everything as a poison which bears within it the seed of sexual pleasure. St. Athanasius said that only the real message of Jesus was the saving grace of chastity. Legends were promulgated about mostly imaginary saints, so holy that they could choose physical torture ahead of sexual pleasure. Medieval theologians said that sex caused the damnation of humanity, which was on its account put out of paradise, and for its sake Christ was killed. But this wasn't just a Christian thing. For example, in pre-Homeric Greece, there was heavily emphasis on goddess worship. Specifically, places like the Minoan Crete, women figured prominently. First, they were represented frequently on all categories of artifacts with the exception of painted pottery where any form of human representation is unusual. Archaeological evidence from Minoan Crete reveals that women were frequently depicted across a wide range of artifacts, figurines, frescoes, seals, and ritual objects, signaling their significant presence and influence. These representations often portrayed women as priestesses, goddesses, or central figures in ceremonial contexts, which then were embodying fertility, nature, and divine power. Interestingly, painted pottery, a common medium in later Greek art, is an exception where human figures are rarely shown in Minoan culture. This suggests a cultural or religious taboo around certain forms of representation, perhaps a different aesthetic or symbolic approach to human integrity. Yet the abundant depictions of other forms highlight the reverence for feminine divine and the centrality of women in Minoan spiritual life. This prominence of women and goddess figures in Minoan Crete contrasts sharply with the later patriarchal Greek society, where the roles and images of women became more restricted and controlled. It found glimpses into a world where female power was visible, celebrated, and integral to the community identity before the gradual eclipse of goddess worship by male-dominated pantheons and patriarchal myths. As the Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age and Indo-European tribes spread across Europe and the Near East, the religious landscape began to change dramatically. The once celebrated great goddess and her many manifestations gradually lost their central place in spiritual life. Male gods such as Zeus, Apollo, and Poseidon rose to dominance, reflecting and reinforcing emerging patriarchal social structures. In this transition, many virgin goddesses like Athena, Artemis, and Hestia, the Virgin Trinity as we know it, and the three virgin goddesses of Greek myth as you know it were recast with new meaning. Their virginity became a less symbol of autonomous power and fertility and more so a sign of chastity, control, and separation from other women and from sexuality itself. The shift served to contain female power with boundaries defined by male authority, and mistranslations and reinterpretations of key terms in ancient texts played a crucial role in this process. For example, the Greek word parthenos, originally meaning unmarried woman or maiden, came to be narrowly associated with sexual purity and virginity, especially in the cult of Athena Parthenos. Over centuries, this linguistic narrowing fed into a religion and religious and cultural narratives that equated female worth with sexual innocence, a concept that was foreign to many earlier goddess traditions when fertility and sexuality were sacred and celebrated. Meanwhile, figures like Medusa, originally a protective or liminal deity, were demonized as mantras to symbolize the dangers of uncontrolled female sexuality and power. This demonization was reinforced through Christian representations where female pagan goddesses and priestesses were recast as witches, harlots, and demons, deepening the stigma around female autonomy. This pattern was not unique to Greece. Across the ancient Near East, Mesopotamian goddesses like Inanna Ishtar, once revered as complex figures embodying both fertility and war, were gradually sidelined or even demonized in patriarchal religious systems. Their sacred sexuality was reframed as dangerous or sinful, further entrenching the association of virginity with moral purity and female submission. As early Christianity emerged, of course, within the complex religious and cultural environment of the Roman Empire, it inherited and transformed many existing myths and symbols, especially those surrounding virginity and womanhood. The figure of the Virgin Mary, which we've discussed in various reels, became central, embodying ideals of purity. The figure of the Virgin Mary, which I've discussed narrowly with the context of the whole virgin myth, became central, embodying ideals of purity, obedience, and spiritual motherhood that aligned closely with the patriarchal values of the new religion sought to promote. Mary's image as the ever-virgin mother was not simply a spontaneous theological invention, but rather a strategic reworking of earlier goddess archetypes and virgin motifs, as we can clearly conclude. She combined elements of fertility goddesses and virgin priestesses into a symbol of divine purity. This was paradoxically both internal and sexually attached. That allowed early Christian leaders to emphasize chastity and submission as spiritual virtues for women, reinforcing social hierarchies and, of course, gender roles. In stark contrast, often prominent female figures in biblical myth, most notably Mary Magdalene, recast in ways that further entrenched patriarchal control. Once a complex and possibly revealed disciple in early Christian communities, Mary Magdalene was later demonized as a repentant prostitute or sinful woman, a narrative that both erased her spiritual authority and also reinforced the dichotomy of the pure virgin versus the fallen woman. This binary echoes older mythological patterns where women embody independent sexuality. This binary echoes older mythological patterns, where women who embodied independent sexuality or spiritual power were marginalized or demonized. The whore of Babylon, a figure in the Book of Revelation, personifies this fear of unruly female sexuality and autonomy, portrayed as a corrupting, destructive force opposed to the pure, submissive ideal. Yet, early Christian texts and church fathers also reinterpreted pagan myths and symbols to serve their agenda. For example, the virginity of goddesses like Artemis and Athena was reframed as a model of chastity and spiritual purity rather than autonomy or power. This emphasis on virginity as a spiritual ideal became a tool for control of women's bodies and sexuality, legitimizing male authority to religious doctrine. Moreover, mistranslations and selective readings of biblical texts reinforce those ideals. Terms related to virginity, as we've discussed, and purity were elevated to near sacred status, while female sexuality was portrayed as dangerous or sinful. These linguistic shifts helped cement centuries of domination by cloaking social control in the language of divine will and spiritual salvation. This Christian elevation of virginity as a supreme virtue deeply permeated medieval and early modern European societies, shaping cultural norms, legal systems, and gender roles for centuries. This ideal of the chaste, obedient virgin, embodied most famously by the Virgin Mary, became a standard against which all women were measured and a tool for controlling female sexuality and autonomy. In medieval Europe, virginity was not only a spiritual ideal but also a social and economic commodity. The Virgin Bride was prized for her purity, which was often linked to family honor and inheritance rights. Laws governing women's behavior, marriage, and sexuality were explicitly designed to protect male lineage and property, with virginity serving as a guarantee of legitimate offspring. Religious institutions reinforced this control through which the veneration of virgin saints and their promotion of virginity as a path to holiness. Nuns who took vows of chastity embodied this ideal, gaining spiritual authority while simultaneously being confined with patriarchal structures. This cult of virgin martyrs as Saint Catherine and Saint Agnes celebrated women who chose death over sexual submission, reinforcing the notion that female virtue was inseparable from female sexual purity. At the same time, women who defied these norms, whether through sexual independence, outspoken behavior, or spiritual leadership, were often demonized. Figures deemed witches, prostitutes, and heretical women were persecuted. Their sexuality and agency framed as threats to social and religious order. The infamously titled witch hunts of the early modern period can be seen as an extension of the sphere where female power outside of patriarchal control was widely suppressed. Virginity myths also influenced literature, art, and popular culture, embedding ideals of female purity and submission into the collective imagination. This Madonna-whore dichotomy, which separated women into categories of saintly virgins or simple temptresses, became a pervasive framework that limited women's roles and identities, and even within the Renaissance and Reformation. It brought social and intellectual change. These deeply rooted myths endured, adapting to new contexts while continuing to justify male dominance. This control of female sexuality remained central, maintaining power structures, with virginity serving as a symbol of both spiritual salvation and social order. And throughout history, this myth of virginity has been far more than a simple marker of purity or innocence. It has been a powerful tool wielded to control, diminish, and dominate womanhood, transforming vibrant female deities and complex heroines into symbols of submission or shame. From the sacred goddess worship of prehistoric society through the cultural shifts of ancient Greece and early Christian societies to the rigid structures of medieval and early modern Europe, virginity myths have been carefully constructed, mistranslated, and weaponized to uphold patriarchal domination. Yet these myths are not immutable truths, but they're cultural constructs, fragile stories shaped by power, fear, and misunderstanding. As we peel back the layers of distortion or claim the original meanings of these myths, we discover a powerful feminine legacy of autonomy, creativity, and spiritual strength. The wild woman, the unapologetic goddess, the fierce protector. These figures remind us that womanhood is not a threat but a vital force of life and transformation. Breaking free from centuries of domination begins by questioning the narratives we have inherited and by honoring the full spectrum of female experience beyond virginity and purity. It is in this reclamation that we find hope, not only for women, but for all who seek justice, equality, and a world where power is shared, not ordered. Virginity in myth is not just a story of control, it is also a story of waiting to be rewritten. And that's why I'm working so consistently on these video essays that I might be compiling into a book. I don't know. I'm currently in the works of this series of women of myth through a radical feminist lens. And what did I meant to say later? So yeah, as I mentioned, if you want to support me, I have a shop named Venusian Gnosis. I also provide tarot readings, but you can also tip me. Like money, tip me, not like give me tips on how to get money or something. With that being said, I'm not just begging just because I'm greedy. I at least recently survived a robbery, which could have ended in my life sentence. So protect the dolls and fund your local dolls. I am Elias of Venus. I am something. I am someone, I hope. So yeah, I'm Elias of Venus, a musician, writer, political activist, and occultist. I am a radical feminist and also a transsexual woman, and this was Virginity and Myth and how Mistranslations became centuries of dominion. Thank you.